I'm Hadar Hazony,
And I'm Titus.
and this is Transvaluation, a series of conversations dedicated to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And since this is our introductory episode, it might be worth saying a few words about why we thought it was a good idea, specifically now, today, to re-engage and re-explore Friedrich Nietzsche's thought. So why do you think, Titus? What's so important about it right now?
Well, it's the first time we have in America a post-Christian right, a post-Christian moment, or a moment of confusion and a new right. And it's also a moment when the standard vision of progress has completely collapsed. And maybe this means also that all horizons are again open.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. We're also in a time of great degeneration. The old ways, the old forms are collapsing around us. Things that used to be expected, both in politics, in the arts, in academia, in philosophy, they don't seem to be working anymore. And Nietzsche was one of the greatest, both prophets, foreseers of the great collapse, but in many ways also the diagnosticians. He was both engaged in describing why things were coming apart and also offered solutions, suggestions, perhaps hopes for how the weakness and stultification of the culture could be overcome. And for that reason, I think that especially Beyond Good and Evil is a very relevant text for our moment. Why do you why do you think particularly a podcast or it's a bit of a conceited word, but why are long form conversations more helpful for understanding Nietzsche than just say shorter videos, YouTube videos, something like that?
Um, Nietzsche writes aphorisms, and there is so much of concentration, and there's so much more of suggestion than of argument or treatise. It's the complete antithesis of technical writing. It's the complete antithesis of the claim that an Enlightenment press is going to enlighten us, that it requires a lot of thought, and it requires developing a familiarity and a taste for what he has to say and how he himself chooses to say it. And that's all on the side of Nietzsche and his form of writing. On our side, as an audience, as readers, we have the digital tools now to do these kinds of conversations that were once confined to a few people here and there. There have been admirers of Nietzsche for the 140 years since the publication of Beyond Good and Evil in 1885, even before that, of course. And he has had a great influence on everything from artists to politics, but he's not a thinker that developed enough of an audience in his own lifetime, or a thinker who had a school, at least afterwards in scholarship, that could define Nietzsche studies or Nietzschean thought. Maybe that was part of Nietzsche's work. He's the first philosopher to get out of the modern academy and to try to burn it down. And with our digital tools, we should try and follow in that path, at least so far as understanding why he would do that. You
So
went to
you're
school,
saying
I
there's
went to
something
school.
ironic about me being an academic writing about Nietzsche. There's something upside down about that.
It's certainly a very awkward position to be in. He wanted to restore to thought this wrong-footedness, this awkward position that makes you aware of the fact that there is no safety in academia. There is no safety in an official teaching. There is no safety when you confront the most important questions. And partly, as you said, it's because he foresaw the great crack up, the massive catastrophes of the 20th century, and even this moment of worry whether religion and free government even make sense or have a future. And with it, of course, also the exhilaration that you can figure out what's worth living and dying for, what makes you human. And
Yeah,
that's
I think
somehow the
also,
stakes.
the vibe, it won't be revealing anything to say that Nietzsche is back in the zeitgeist. I don't think that it's just you and me who have a reinvigorated interest in his thought, but it's really troubling that conversations about Nietzsche tend to be so shallow. Uh, I don't know if that's caused by most people not having actually read him, although I do believe that's a big part of it. Um, or maybe certain stylistic choices that he makes lend to a shallow reading, and we can get into that later. But nevertheless, I constantly see online people who reduce, simplify, uh, they make Nietzsche seem stupid. I think that that's just all too common. And I think a more extended exploration, not necessarily an academic exploration, not necessarily a dull and dreary exploration, because that would be, well, again, un-Nietzschean, but a more serious and a more thought out and closer reading of Nietzsche, I think can do a lot in this moment to give some clarity, where, as you said, there doesn't seem to be exactly a clear understanding of who Nietzsche was and what did he actually think. And instead you have these little sound bites and these little pieces floating around, which in general I find to be less than helpful, quite detrimental, actually.
Yeah, we might as well face it. Nietzsche liked to say shocking things, and so he's instantly quotable. And especially in a digital age, you can pass around these snippets, these memes, and that can do the work of thought. But the result is that he's inevitably reduced to the level of the medium. He's inevitably reduced to the uh, idiocy that plagues everything else. But it's not all there is to digital. We can see each other. You can reach out and talk at length and think through a matter and try and figure out why the world that we live in is the way it is. Nietzsche tried to understand, but also to change this world. And in both of these ways, he's had more success than any other philosopher since. In that sense, he was the last one to set a task for himself to change the world, and at least to some extent, to accomplish that. That sense of power should be more interesting than the fact that he's instantly quotable. And this should encourage people to think more about what he saw and why he acted the way he did. And there's something in the sustained reflection in our long conversations that is a little like Nietzsche's solitude, composing things that are forever addressed to somebody. And we might be part of that audience as well as some part of our audience.
Well, I hope to be. But having said that, let's let him speak for himself, and turn to the preface of Beyond Good and Evil and try to see what he has to say. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? Are there not grounds for the suspicion that all philosophers, insofar as they were dogmatists, have been very inexpert about women? That the gruesome seriousness, the clumsy obtrusiveness with which they have usually approached truth so far have been awkward and very improper methods for winning a woman's heart. What is certain is that she has not allowed herself to be won. And today, every kind of dogmatism is left standing dispirited and discouraged, if it is left standing at all. For there are scoffers who claim that it has fallen, that all dogmatism lies on the ground, even more, that all dogmatism is dying.
So this was written in 1885. Dogmatism has been dying for this 140 years and presumably is not entirely dead. but it is a position that is increasingly seen as obsolete. It's not clear what can replace the posing of the dogmas. He means the dogmas of enlightenment, but the dogmas of philosophy more broadly. The claim that you can state the most important truths and work your way through a series of propositions or arguments in such a way as to defend those statements. And there was some reason in his time to think that this was not going to last much longer. But I think it's still as provocative a statement now as it was then, partly because science and aping its social science have had so much more success and such a power over the public, over the state, or over the reading public, the newspapers. But partly, I think, because as Nietzsche saw, there is a crisis and people take refuge to the extent to which it's possible in scientific claims, precisely because they're aware that there's a crisis and there's no solving it, they think.
I think you're certainly right that they're both in his time philosophically, and we haven't really solved the problems, the philosophical problems that were coming up at that time. And today, I think politically, you definitely can see the reverberations of that. Um, the old worldviews don't appear to be holding uh, the scaffolding of what we believe to be proper and correct and moral does not seem to be solid. But what do you make of this issue of truth as a woman? Why does he choose that metaphor to kind of embarrass the dogmatists?
Enlightenment was a very public time. It was a matter of words, of statements, and they were supposed to have the power of deeds and change the world. In that sense, it's the manliest thing you could do. It's not going to be Achilles. It's going to be some asshole in a college who can say that he's truly a man of his word, that his life is truly, in the service of truth. And Nietzsche finds all this stuff incredibly ridiculous. The claims of intelligence and of the application of intelligence to solving the human problems can also be creepy, not just ridiculous. But primarily, he looks at the ridiculous side, and he has this taste for provocation, and for not just shock but comedy. He's clearly laughing at these kinds of people, but he's not just laughing at the dogmatists who are in ruin, who have lost their spirit. He thinks the matter is in itself funny. In a way, all our incredibly educated elites are nothing but clever schoolboys running around thinking they have figured out so much. And they're so proud and they're such know-it-alls, they want to tell you everything that they know. But but in a way, they've avoided entirely the experience of learning. That is, I think, a way to get to what it might mean for the truth to be a woman. Not possessed yet, but so alluring. And therefore more of the character of learning than the character of knowing, or worse, being a know-it-all show-off. That's bad style. It's bad taste. And then the suggestion is that it would take taste, it would take seduction to get at the truth. That the truth about the most important things is elusive, like women might be elusive, and it is alluring for that reason.
There's also there's obviously a long tradition of referencing wisdom as a woman, right? It goes all the way back to the Bible, to Solomon. Bacon refers to truth as a woman. Um, in Bacon, the critique of the Aristotelians, that is, of the dogmatists, is exactly this: that they have made truth barren, and that she is not bearing children because of their ineptitude. And there also appears to be a kind of, I mean, you referenced this. He is laughing at their expense their inability to woo truth, that the method with which dogmatists approach trying to acquire wisdom, their so-called love of wisdom, it's rigid, it's put on, inauthentic, mechanical. And there's something about that which appears to actually impede a person's ability to attain the truth. That somehow the truth, as you said, is elusive. And if you were to try to win it over, if you were to try to get into its good graces, uh, gain its favor, you can't do that by um, being overly autistic and thinking that, mathematical formulas are going to win over her heart. And so truth is, it will have to be approached in a different way if we're to acquire it at all.
Yeah, as a matter of style, what he says about woman is true of his style. It's about dropping hints, making suggestions, and making you think the thought for yourself rather than spelling it out. A woman has a power of attraction. She doesn't have to sell herself. Arguments, extended argument in a treatise, that has the character of selling thought or thought selling itself, trying too hard. I'll give you enlightenment. I'll put it in your head. I'll chew your food for you and digest it for you too. There's something presumptuous, but also something terribly needy about that. And in both ways, it falls short of the mark that Nietzsche sets for himself in his style. But of course, the womanliness of truth is not just a matter of style. It also carries this dangerous moral, psychological suggestion. Might not be rational. There's something infuriating about women because they are so irrational. You're not supposed to say that anymore because irrational people will be infuriated if you do. But that proves the point. And that's part of the illusion too, that men have stayed away from women as in this philosophical sense because it would be trouble. It wouldn't be something clear, public, honest, above the board. It might be deceptious. Women could be deceiving. And beyond this psychological suggestion, there's a deeper problem of first philosophy, of metaphysics. Enlightenment is enlightenment of man and of the world. You're supposed to come to know these things that themselves come before knowledge. Knowledge is of something. It's in a certain sense derivative. It's derivative of experience, hence the importance of psychology and style. But it's also derivative, of course, of the beings you're trying to acquire knowledge of themselves. And it's not clear to what extent those beings let themselves be known. And in that sense, Nietzsche says that we have some grounds to suspect these people, but what is certain is that they haven't succeeded so far. All of the great progress achieved is in the fundamental ways, not only limited, but blinding. And what it blinds you to is this problem, what it even means to become aware of the beings of which you're trying to acquire knowledge. Far from building a much higher edifice of learning, even more university, even more buildings, even more research, we should be digging deeper into our own souls, but of course also into the things.
So, in that sense, we certainly see Nietzsche mocking the put on seriousness, the artificiality of logic and of dogmatism. But then, interestingly, he goes on to say, speaking seriously, there are good reasons why all philosophical dogmatizing, however solemn and definitive its errors used to be, may nevertheless have been no more than a noble childishness and tyrannism. And perhaps the time is at hand when it will be comprehended again and again how little used to be sufficient to furnish the cornerstone for such sublime and unconditional philosophers' edifices as the dogmatists have built so far. Any old popular superstition from time immemorial, like the soul superstition, which, in the form of the subject and ego superstition, has not yet ceased to do its mischief. Some play on words, perhaps, a seduction by grammar, or an audacious generalization of very narrow, very personal, very human, all too human facts.
Here we begin to see that his attack on science, on dogmatism, is comprehensive. He's not just annoyed at how narrow-minded people became in the 19th century. He thinks that, in a way, the role of a piece. And therefore, maybe it's almost like human nature. If people from ancient superstitions to the most modern systems have a certain something in common, this habit of dogmatizing, this building of edifices that have something noble about them, it's a great achievement, or it's at least a great attempt to try to understand the universe, to make, say, the university the correlative of the universe, the known, the correlative of the beings. There's nobleness in that, but it's also childish, he suggests. It lacks a real coming to grips with things. It is, as childishness may be a good beginning, maybe an inevitable beginning, maybe the beginning childishness is not the highest stage. I think that's a fairly obvious suggestion. But even if it is a necessary mistake to make, even if it is noble as a beginning, that's not the same thing as philosophy in the sense he means it. Beyond good and evil suggests that we have to go beyond what has been, beyond all of the teachings. But the subtitle for Spiel to philosophy of the future suggests that philosophy is his business and the future is also his business, and that he can somehow put them together as it was right then, right there, but also that we could do it in thinking through this criticism. What's wrong with dogmatism? What is the thing beyond which we wish to go? What's wrong with it is this odd childishness.
And there's something profoundly unserious about children, right? So, on the one hand, the first paragraph indicates that they have been all too serious. They take themselves too seriously, that they don't know how to laugh. They don't know how to be spontaneous. But from this other perspective, Nietzsche suggests they haven't, philosophers up till now, dogmatists at any rate, have been not nearly serious enough. And this ties into this question of childishness and nobility. Nobility is a concept which will come up over and over again. One of the sections of the book is called What is Noble? And nobility for Nietzsche is a kind of self-projection, a kind of assumption that the world is going to obey your commands. And these philosophers, these dogmatists, they say things about the world, they generalize about the world, things that are human, things that are all too human. And they think that their experiences of the world are the world. So there is this confusion or misunderstanding of knowledge where they assume that what's in their head is the truth, the thing that is external. And there is no ability to ask secondary questions. Why do I think what I think? Why do I think what I think? What is the meaning of me thinking? Why do I spend time thinking? These are all questions that Nietzsche is very preoccupied with, and they're serious questions. And there's a certain problem in the pursuit of the truth, we'll see in book one, where even the pursuit of the truth itself is a thing that must be investigated if we ever are able to trust anything that we come up with that is supposed to be truth. And so there's a very real way in which dogmatists fail to ask second order questions. Their thinking is childish in the sense that it is not grown to observe itself. It is not questioning itself. It does not pose to itself questions about why it's pursuing truth. And so all the truths that it does find are somehow marred by that. They're marred by assumptions, generalizations, human characteristics, which may not be part of the truth.
Yeah, so what is sacrificed in the process of dogmatizing? Self-knowledge. And then why is it sacrificed, or in what way is it sacrificed? It's because people believe in the soul, or if they feel they're very modern and scientific, they just say the ego, as though that makes any difference. That is a presumption that presumes that we know how we're connected to the world. How are you aware of the beings of which you wish to acquire knowledge? And therefore that we have at least certainty in who we are. And so you can see from the political point of view, Nietzsche attacks Enlightenment at its weakest point. Nobody can really look at the creatures of Enlightenment and admire them. Scientists are not particularly impressive people. And of course, they don't have a good reason for what they do. They can't answer the question, why do science? Why can't they answer that? Because they don't know themselves. They don't know why they even want to do it. They don't know what it does to them either. They lack that level of self-scrutiny that's on the way to self-understanding. That is where they are weakest. But in a way, it's also the most obvious fact. Obviously, we produce research knowledge all the time, but nobody believes any of these people are wise. They have a great weakness. The ordinary and the intelligent man are aware of it, even if academics themselves or scientists or their votaries aren't. And so there, Nietzsche finds a great opportunity for his political attack. But it's a great opportunity because it points to a deeper human question that you're suggesting is to do with second-order questions, with a kind of skepticism of oneself. In starting from this edifice of enlightenment he's tearing down, Nietzsche doesn't have to set up his own dogmas. In starting from these dogmas and seeing what's wrong with them, he can liberate himself gradually from the prejudices of the time, but perhaps from all prejudices, in the sense that dogmatizing seems to be the character of human thought, and or is the most obvious part of it. And in going against it, he can liberate thought as such from these patterns, not just from the history, but from the psychology of it. Why are you doing this? Why are we drawn to that system building?
And raising the issue of the soul, or as you noted, modern people like to refer to it as the ego, it also ties once more into this joke or metaphor of truth as a woman, because there's a certain degree to which our desire to know truth is wrapped up in our confidence in ourselves. If we believe that we've been misled, we feel humiliated. And if we feel that we know, it makes us proud. And so there's a certain emotive drive that is pushing towards the truth that comes from this conception of I am a self. I know, I can know. The things that I know are true. And one really must ask themselves, is there any legitimacy to these claims? I know, I can know. The fact that I know makes me better than you. These kinds of assumptions which human beings always make. But why do we make them? And are they actually conducive to learning, to truth seeking? It's not clear to me that they are. The dogmatist's philosophy was, let us hope, only a promise across millennia, as astrology was in earlier times when perhaps more work, money, acuteness, and patience were lavished in its service than for any real science so far. To astrology and its supraterrestrial claims, we owe the grand style of architecture in Asia and Egypt. It seems that all great things first have to bestride the earth in monstrous and frightening masks in order to inscribe themselves in the hearts of humanity with eternal demands. Dogmatic philosophy was such a mask. For example, the Vedanta doctrine in Asia and Platonism in Europe.
So you have the Indo-Europeans on one side and the Middle East and Egypt on the other side. They're one of them a kind of scientific claim associated with tyranny, and the other one is not a scientific claim, it's a moral claim. And that might be associated with freedom instead of despotism. There's a lot to think through in these suggestions, as of course, reading, say, the Zarathustra to figure out what he says about these various peoples. But it's noticeable that more variations appear once he explains his criticism of dogmatism as an analysis of world history. Look to basic issues. Why is there astrology? Because the stars shine. It is the fact that they seem impervious to every change, and the world is nothing but change, it seems, that makes the stars so impressive. And that power, if it could be involved in our concerns, our troubles would go away. That consumed so much more wealth and human effort and ingenuity, says, than science. What do people put their passions into? How do these things cash out? It's a civilization or a culture, it's a political arrangement, and it leads to greatness. But in a way, it's a monstrous thing. But he says maybe it is just a mask, that monstrous thing. Here he says, let us hope. There's hope in going beyond good and evil, but not certainty. What's certain instead is the psychological origin of these ways of life that Nietzsche called cultures. The severe style of architecture, the pyramids, what they call Babel in the Old Testament, that is man's noble striving to build an edifice like a philosopher builds an edifice, but to build it in brick and stone with human bodies. It's in a way, it's not so funny anymore. The same error of the dogmatists is the clumsy philosopher and the great Sumerian kings or Egyptian pharaohs. And the difference is doing it in speech and doing it in deed. But they both come with a certain nobility before us because they tried to grasp the universe, to face the human drama, weakness, uncertainty, and they reached out to the stars, as indeed the pyramids and ziggurats did. They achieved this pure geometry, they attempted it. They saw something permanent and perhaps all powerful out there in the cosmos. But the result of that was despotism. And the other option he offers, Platonism and the Vedanta, that refers to the immortality of the soul, possibly to reincarnation, to the hope that the power is in life rather than in the cosmos. But those would be the two aspects of thought, science and morality. One of them issues in the arts, like the architecture and all of the things that flourish in these ancient cities. The other one refers to morality, to the inner strength of human beings. As he says, to inscribe in the hearts of humanity with eternal demands, things must, however great, first appear monstrous. There's something more impressive than the pyramids. It's what they did to people, what kinds of people not built them, and what kinds of people those buildings in turn created. There's something more important than what was the intellectual claim in all of those attempts. The moral effects are more important. They created human types, they created cultures that in certain cases achieved or lasted for millennia. And there is ground to say, let us hope this could turn into philosophy. This could turn into a real way of life for human beings, if real is the word we want here. But so far, it hasn't.
But there's a certain degree with which it's a mask. And this issue of the mask will also come up again and again. And to Nietzsche, things are not what they are always in the same way. Things have this habit of appearing to be one thing and becoming another thing. Or one of the characteristics of an object or a movement or a person may be very external in the beginning and then fade away to become very internalized. And dogmatic philosophy, as you said, it on the one hand is this great arranging of human beings, human thought, in accordance with a certain order. But there's also this knowledge in the background, which is that astrology is not real. The stars do not care about you. They are doing their thing, and their power is not coming down to save you, right? The external eternal power it has absolutely, it pays no mind to you and your problems. But nevertheless, the belief that astrology did control people and the attempt to marshal all of humanity, entire cultures, city states, empires, in accordance with the stars, produced these titanic, colossal human achievements. And so there's this duality or this tension that, on the one hand, the beliefs themselves, no matter how noble they were false. And yet at the same time, those very false beliefs were the thing that made it possible to create the most noble, the most impressive human types, as you said. And so things appear to come into the world as masks and entice us, draw us in. But we may later find out that the thing that we believed was eternal, unchanging, stable, powerful, it may not have the character that we initially believed. That doesn't mean that the fact that we believed it had that character does not affect us. And indeed, it is to be hoped that although philosophy has not borne the fruit that it promised, and after engaging in it for a couple thousand years, we are at this point where it seems that philosophy has really let us down. Nietzsche is still saying it can be that even though philosophy has broken down in various ways, the hopes that it engendered in us can arouse in us an aspiration, a movement, an attempt to make something as grand and as powerful as the pyramids. Let us not be ungrateful to it, he says, although it must certainly be conceded that the worst, most durable, and most dangerous of all errors so far was a dogmatist error, namely, Plato's invention of the pure spirit and the good as such. But now that that is overcome, now that Europe is breathing freely again after this nightmare, and at least can enjoy a healthier sleep, we, whose task is wakefulness itself, are the heirs of all that strength which has been fostered by the fight against this error. To be sure, it meant standing truth on her head and denying perspective, the basic condition of all life, when one spoke of spirit and the good as Plato did. Indeed, as a physician one might ask, how could the most beautiful growth of antiquity, Plato, contract such a disease? Did the wicked Socrates corrupt him after all? Could Socrates have been the corrupter of the youth after all? And did he deserve his hemlock?
This is the core story in philosophy. From a certain point of view, philosophy is a little like a religion. You have this martyr of philosophy in Socrates. And Plato, of course, brings out the gospel of Socrates, if you will, like the apostles do for Christianity, like Torah does for the teaching of Moses. So it's necessary in Nietzsche's attack on dogmatism to go to the root, and the root of it is Socrates. Philosophy somehow follows from his name. The claim that Socrates was wise, that he was a lover of wisdom, that he had human wisdom, as he says in Plato's Apology of Socrates, is Nietzsche thinks the origin of all this catastrophe, the nightmare that is European life. That's an interesting thing to think about. Nietzsche was, of course, fond to call himself a European, and also to make fun of Europeans. But here he describes those 2000 something years from Plato to Nietzsche as a nightmare. Why is that? Because on the basis of this great story of the sacrifice of Socrates, of this amazing guy who, as any prophet should, didn't fear death, and so on and so forth. On that basis, people were robbed of something, of basic things like asking, what's in it for me? Or being able to say, well, it looks to me, and go from there. That's perspective. That's self-interest. Plato robbed people of that. He forced them to think of the good as such, not what's in it for me. He forced them to talk about anything but what it appears to them like, to look for that which is, for a being, for maybe an idea. And so idealism is what Nietzsche looks at and thinks, this is a nightmare. What has this done to mankind? It's but with typical Nietzscheanism, he thinks we shouldn't be ungrateful to it. As you're saying about the masks, these errors are necessary. Maybe there's something in what we have achieved. This is, we breathe freely. We've liberated ourselves from this burden, but we're asleep, not awake, asleep. The task is wakefulness. The reality is sleep. There you see that liberating oneself from Platonism wouldn't solve the problem. As you're saying, finding in that dogmatism its roots, its engine, and what it actually achieved as opposed to the delusions that moved it, that could be a guide, you could say, to do it purposefully, to see what Platonism did unwittingly, to see what dogmatism did unwittingly, and to do it wittingly, to understand what it means for human beings to imagine and endeavor and desire, set themselves a great task, organize for an achievement in a culture, as a people, and do that on purpose. That would mean for there to be a future. That is to say, not simply things happening, not simply events eventuating, but something done on purpose, but in a new way, beyond what has happened, in the sense of being done in full consciousness of history, of what has happened and how it has happened, of the delusions, their character, the purpose they served, and why they no longer serve that purpose.
And there's a certain sense in which the delusion itself, it has been a gift to us. So there is no doubt that he claims that it is a delusion, that the good as such, Platonism, this aspiration for eternal truths that are never changing, that this is a delusion, even a nightmare. Why is it a nightmare? Because it is never achieved. Because you walk through life and you aspire to the good as such, an aspiration which can never be consummated, because there is no such good as such in the world, something that Plato himself may have agreed with. So there is this need or desire or drive which is habituated into us because of thousands of years of a certain aspiration, a certain desire that has been spread throughout humanity. But that desire, like astrology, which itself was a lie, but resulted in the construction of the pyramids, could it be that we have now acquired a monumentous desire, a desire to bring about massive, great change? The good as such, it's the greatest change that you could possibly imagine, right? And we have that desire now. We were bred or habituated to have that desire by Platonism. And so there's a kind of tension that has been growing and increasing inside of us. And the closer we are to finding that that desire is not consummated, not fulfilled, that only increases the tension. And so Nietzsche does not want us to fall back asleep from the nightmares, from the fits and the fears that the delusion is not coming to be. On the contrary, he wants us to let go of the delusion, but he wants us, as you said, to go through that period of sleep to a full awakening. And that full awakening, I mean, we'll have to read the book to understand what it really means. But in some ways, it is closer to the Platonic nightmare than it is to mere sleep, right? It expresses that tension or that desire or that energy. And hopefully, it can drive us or energize us to attempt something as great as they attempted, to reach out to the stars the way that the pharaohs reached out to the stars, to construct a civilization, a culture that would last for 5,000 years the way that the Egyptians did, or a culture that lasted for 2,000 years the same way that Platonic Christianity did, right? So, on the one hand, it is certainly a mask which we are every day uh, unveiling. But at the same time, that mask has given us something. It has created in us something. And that thing should be, or it should be unleashed. It should be released, not released as in let go, let to dissipate, but released as an explosion, as an attempt.
Yeah, so if you compare this phrase, the nightmare, the sleep, to the initial position, maybe truth is a woman, there's a lot to be said for the fact that, like women, dreaming is all about images and desires and the irrational. And deception is involved, of course. It's a realm of images, not certainties, not solid facts, as we would say. But on the other hand, there's a great difference between talking about wooing, however ineptly, and talking about nightmare. In a way, he elucidates, as you suggested, that the Platonic realm of ideas or forms is very paradise. That's a dream. What happens when you can't get it and you keep trying and you keep trying and you keep trying? Something, the bloom wears off. All of a sudden, it started all rose, now it's all thorns. All of a sudden, the building up of progress of enlightenment to achieve the true and pure good, that becomes a nightmare. And that's in a way a verdict on mankind. We are in a way compelled to act, compelled to change our minds, compelled to go beyond dogmatism, because one way or another there will be consequences for what has happened. And one consequence would be sleep, and the other would be wakefulness, but they are very different consequences. Say the two different futures open before mankind. And the one that's already in action is sleep. But the desirable one, wakefulness, is something else and much more difficult, much harder of access or even of understanding. Hence the need to act. And so maybe Socrates deserved to be killed for corrupting the youth. Maybe he was bad for Athens. But what was bad for mankind was not Socrates, it was Plato. And they killed the wrong guy partly because they misunderstood the character of the activity of Platonism, of dogmatism. You can't stop it as simply as killing somebody. And so Nietzsche sets himself against Plato, finally, the right target after so long, and he sets himself against Plato at the right level, trying to oppose this philosophy as a philosophy and trying to range philosophy, unlike in the case of Socrates, on the side of life rather than on the side of death. Maybe Socrates did deserve the poison. But if mankind is to not deserve the poison, then another philosophy is needed that ranges itself on the side of life against this sort of deadly or nightmarish dogmatism.
And it's really interesting that you raised this question of maybe Socrates deserved the hemlock, because people who read philosophy, philosophers in general, as you mentioned earlier, they see Socrates as a kind of hero, and therefore philosophy as this kind of virtuous activity. And Nietzsche presumably is in some ways engaging in philosophy. There's no doubt. But from the outset, he, in some ways, is indicating he's going to do it differently because he wants to place Socrates as the villain, as you said, the corrupter of the Athenian youth. And he's asking this project of philosophy, of asking ourselves, what is true and what is the purpose of life and why do we do the things that we do? Has that really been good for us? Is thinking about what we're doing, does that in any way help what we're doing? And if the good is such, rules out perspective, which is the fundamental assumption of every living organism that they are a particular, engaging in the world from a particular point of view, and that their good, their interest, their health, if all those things are not the correct way to approach philosophy, can it be that philosophy itself is against life, weakens life, destabilizes life? That would make it certainly a nightmare. And more so, it would make it a poison. And so, if Socrates has propagated this poison on humanity, then it certainly would have been just to make him drink the hemlock, right? An eye for an eye, as one might say. Now, Nietzsche doesn't say that. He doesn't say it. He poses it as a question. It's so radical. It's so far reaching. It's such a different position towards philosophy and towards thought that Nietzsche only, and he does this often in Beyond Good and Evil especially, he poses it as a question, as something to be considered. Each person will have to come to their own conclusion about that. But nevertheless, having assumed that this may be the case, if we were to attempt wakefulness, we would have to do it in a different way. We would have to do it in a way that did not undermine our ability to live, that did not undermine our faith in the world, in reality, in life.
Yeah, that's the task ahead. And to a large extent, it seems like the task ahead has to be patterned on what has been done before, but with a new awareness. Some of the seriousness you talked about at the beginning of our discussion. At least when people think about Socrates, they should be thinking that philosophy is a way of life and that it's an issue of life and death, and that thinking has consequences, that it's not the empty nonsense of academia, it's not the fatuity of talk about freedom of speech. If man is an animal that dreams and thinks and attempts to make sense of the world, there are consequences to that. To the extent to which these things can be got right, we see them in great works of art or in great cultures. But also we can see them fall apart, which is our experience of this prolonged, negotiated, ongoing decadence. And if it were a choice, better that Socrates die and Athens live. We somehow get that. We have to range ourselves on the side of life. Again, we have to reject the pure good and stick up for ourselves. Say, what's in it for me? But of course, that's not enough to solve the problem. It's not enough to have a Roman soldier kill Archimedes on the beaches of Syracuse. That would not put an end to Greek knowledge, not even in Rome. What is needed instead is conducting this experiment in thought. As Nietzsche says, Beyond Good and Evil is an experiment. It's a kind of opening. It's an introduction. And as you were saying, he's full of questions, suggestions, provocations. He wants to put thoughts in people's heads, but to have them think those thoughts for themselves. Because only there does it begin to show how important the issue is. And only after you see that can you begin to ask yourself, maybe it is that important too to say it in this way. Maybe we need not another treatise or self-help or anything like that. Maybe what we need is aphorism and the thought that lingers and dwells on these things, and in our case, the conversation, trying to articulate what's happening here. What is the attraction of this presentation, and what is the suggestion of the answer?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you raised this question of um, thinking as a serious matter, that it has consequences. Because I think people usually assume the more we think, the more we know. The more we learn, the more we know. It must be good. And something cannot be taken seriously if it is not dangerous. And Nietzsche is suggesting not only, I mean, there is a civilizational element, right? That philosophy has been in some ways dangerous to our civilization. But there is also a personal element. Philosophy can be dangerous to you, you who engages in it, you who listens to Socrates, the Sphinx, and starts entertaining these questions that he asks you. One might even say entertaining these questions that Nietzsche is asking you. This might not be a safe activity. You don't know what it's going to do to you. And you don't know that it's going to make you stronger, more survivable. There is at least a possibility that it will take you down a path which you will not be able to return from and which will end in a nightmare. And that is just a characteristic of thought, of true actual thought. And as you said, not what most people consider to be thought, which is just asserting the same assertions that they've already believed before, right? But really asking questions takes you into the unknown. And by definition, the unknown can be dangerous, is dangerous. Now, perhaps you will cross the sea, you will traverse the desert, and you will survive. And perhaps not. But if you embark on this journey of thought, there is no knowing where it will take you. Only a dogmatist thinks that he knows where truth will take him as he sets out to find it. But anyone who takes truth seriously, that is to say, entertains truth, pursues truth, flirts with truth, attempts to seduce truth, knows that truth is capricious and that he cannot foresee how it's going to end.
Yeah, it's worth noticing that at the beginning and at the end of the history of philosophy with Socrates and Nietzsche, you have great questioners. And that's not the character in which most philosophers present their thought. And related to that, this oddity in thought, all of us who think we are of superior intelligence must face now and then moments where you can't really think. Attempts willfully to be smarter, to come up with an answer to a problem, to force yourself through a question. You're not exactly in control. So it's could be a very humbling experience for some, could be a very revealing experience to others. And yeah, it may put you in mind of the possibility that truth is a woman.
But the fight against Plato, or to speak more clearly and for the people, the fight against the Christian ecclesiastical pressure of millennia, for Christianity is Platonism for the people, has created in Europe a magnificent tension of the spirit, the like of which has never yet existed on earth, which with so tense a bow we can now shoot for the most distant goals. To be sure, European man experiences this tension as need and distress. Twice already attempts have been made in the grand style to unbend the bow, once by the means of Jesuitism, the second time by the means of the democratic Enlightenment, which, with the aid of freedom of the press and newspaper reading, might indeed bring it about that the spirit would no longer experience itself so easily as a need. The Germans have invented gunpowder, all due respect for that, but then they made up for that. They invented the press. But we, who are neither Jesuits nor Democrats, nor even German enough, we good Europeans and free, very free spirits, we still feel it, the whole need of the spirit and the whole tension of its bow, and perhaps also the arrow, the task, and who knows, the goal.
as you were suggesting before, the historical transformation, the psychological experiences that become civilizations, the masks that become your character, that's what Platonism did. That's what Christianity did. It promised people paradise. It forced them, therefore, every day in confronting misery, uncertainty, suffering, to stretch themselves out into the beyond, into the hereafter. Beyond good and evil, in that sense, is an answer to the hereafter, to the beyond evil, to beyond the world, to the otherworldliness of Christianity and the otherworldliness of the myths that Socrates offers in the dialogues of Plato. And that is somehow now the character of the world. It was once maybe the priestly class in their ziggurats, but now it's somehow many people, most people maybe, to some extent they have been affected. This problem has generalized the deferring of life up until the hereafter, the longing and the trudging and the discipline and the suffering and putting off, not for tomorrow, not for next year, but until you die, the things that most burn in your heart. And as you were saying before, these necessary mistakes have great consequences and impressive consequences. They have made people capable of a great project. They have made people capable of so much endeavoring, of aiming so high, partly because they made people aware. It is not possible to be transformed in the way in which he describes without becoming aware of it. You become aware of what's inside of you, of your longings, your needs, of the trouble and your reaction to trouble. You become aware of this great distinction between the way you long and the way you experience yourself in the world. That depth of being human could be aimed at something. But of course, there are dangers. The first danger, Jesuitism, that's the Baroque, that's the last moment of European aristocracy. It's a certain kind of reasonableness or rationalism aimed at explaining away sin. You don't have to worry so much about Jesus Christ bleeding on the cross. You don't have to worry so much about hellfire. None of these sins are that big a deal. Maybe you're not, after all, originally sinful. It's a weird use of morality and religion, the pomp and circumstance on the one hand, and the reasoning of the Catholic teaching on the other hand, to undermine itself. This is, in a sense, why Jesuitism is not such a problem and why it's such an obvious problem. It's just, you could say, institutionalized hypocrisy. It's sort of like selling indulgences for sins. It's trading away your conscience. Nietzsche doesn't like that idea. He would rather people feel miserable than that they not feel anything, than they feel bored or reassured. Nothing is more horrifying than being therapeutically content, calm, copacetic.
Couch potato. Just
Yeah.
vegging out, sitting on the couch, smoking a joint, watching Netflix. Nothing matters.
Life can't be flatlining. You just can't. But the democratic enlightenment, I think he thinks is even worse. And partly it's more recent, it's more ambitious, but partly it's because it appeals to the demos more than to the aristocracy, and it has much more powerful weaponry, both in its rationality and in its technology, putting the two together really. And the example he gives, modern technologies, the gunpowder and the press. The gunpowder he's for because preference for war over peace is a preference for life over boredom, decadence, and death. And so the Germans deserve the honor of having invented gunpowder. To the extent to which they are violent and their thought leads to violence, there's still hope for mankind. But the press he's against. That reassures everybody that they know that somewhere, somehow, progress is being made. It'll be delivered, mail delivered to their doors. Now we have it delivered maybe on smartphones. We can rest assured and therefore rest. We no longer need to achieve anything. We no longer need to wonder. We no longer need to think. In fact, that which is inside of you, with the Jesuits and dealing with sin, your guilt is still a passion in your heart. With the democratic enlightenment, your thoughts, your questions, your democratic attacks, maybe on the privileges of the past, of the priest and the aristocrat, and so on. Those are thoughts inside of you. They are life. They make you who you are. And because they point you to what you might be in opposing these things. But with democratic enlightenment, all of those things can be taken out of you and be served on a smartphone. You can just scroll them on a screen and be part of the revolution or the resistance or the whatever. And it takes not just no effort, but it takes away from you the possibility of making an effort. It no longer allows people to achieve something for themselves. The Jesuits put you beyond good and evil, and in a certain way, so do the enlightened Democrats, at the cheapest possible price. What is the marginal cost of saving another guy from trouble? Zero. It scales, as we say, but it's inhuman.
The mask in the beginning, 3 paragraphs ago, we begin speaking about Platonism, Socrates, philosophy. But now that mask is somewhat removed, and we reveal Christianity as this monolith that we have been carrying on our backs, right? It's this great burden. He uses this metaphor of the bow. What is the effect on a body for having to carry a very, very heavy load for a very long time? It creates tension, it creates force. And all of a sudden, this burden has been removed because of its own inherent inconsistencies. But how we remove it is just as important as removing it itself. There is this danger, as you said, that we're going to fall asleep. We're just going to sit back and relax and chill out and become meaningless matter. That is a real possibility as a product of the Enlightenment. Is a real horrifying thought that we will recognize that everything in life is meaningless, that nothing we do matters, and that we will simply give up. And what is the main technology that threatens that? The newspapers. And as you pointed today, it would certainly be the smartphone. But the smartphone as a symbol, as a representative of constant, ridiculous, superfluous, frivolous stimulation. That you would descend to recognize yourself merely as a body stimulated by random energy, random objects, and that all there is to your existence is the stimulation and relief of basic physical needs. That is a real possible product of Enlightenment democracy. That there is no hierarchy, that there is nothing higher, that there is nothing outside that you aspire to. And so you would sit back and you would just scroll your phone, scroll the feed, Netflix on the television, watch pornography, and degenerate into a biological mass with no drive, no purpose, no aspiration, no goal. That's not the task of the wakers. That is not the task of the wakeful. And so when we release this bow, it matters how we do it. If we are to recognize that there have been fundamental mistakes in the edifice of dogmatic philosophy, we cannot do it in such a way which results, or we very much can, but it would be a nightmare. It would be horrific for us to do it in such a way which would take away any goal and any aspiration that we have. And we're at this point, we're at this branching, at least Nietzsche thought he was at, in the 1880s, where civilization has a choice. This massive tension that has been built up, will it be shot out into the stars? Will we aspire to get to Mars and to go beyond? Will we try to become everything that we have aspired to be? Or will we give up and say everything has been a lie. We've always been lied to, tricked to believe that there's something more, and so we will lay down in the dirt and descend into becoming animals. That is the choice that stands before us. And technology is a major danger, right? As insofar as it perpetuates the choice into nihilism and into giving up, despair, rather than the goal, the hope, which is provided to us by Christianity, by Platonism, by the dogmatism of the past.
Yeah, it's perfectly possible for people to become progressive and therefore to simply despise the past and therefore also assume that they've liberated themselves from it. And as a consequence of that unwisdom, lose their humanity, not their prejudices, or lose their humanity as soon as they lose their prejudices. And I think we've often seen that with people. You go to college with people, and not everybody makes it out, and not actually everybody makes it out alive either. A lot of people lose their prejudices and everything else soon besides. It happens. But Nietzsche instead thinks we should think of the past as much more dangerous and therefore much more alive. We should be aware in ourselves of ancient prejudices. We should think of ourselves as heirs of this great Europe, as he puts it. We're Europeans, good Europeans, and very free spirits. That self-understanding prepares that task to attempt at least as much as was attempted before and to achieve more than was achieved before. And that's, you could say, a mix of ancient and modern. It has a grand noble attempt as ancient doctrines did, but it also has, like modern teachings, more achievement. The problem, of course, is that modern achievements are predicated on increasingly animal behavior, and that's not acceptable for anybody who thinks of himself as a human being. You cannot but experience your longings, your needs, your passions, and your orientation by whatever you can learn as something of a destiny, part of a greater destiny, together with other people. And there are obligations and powers in that self-understanding that he talks of as Europe, which in another place he calls a planetary conscience or planetary culture. You have to think in that way with that kind of ambition, and therefore you might need the pattern that is learned if you wrestle with the past, if you pick for yourself the greatest enemy. People today might want to fix another disease, save some more people from death, something like that. Nietzsche would say that that's paltry compared to trying to put down the ghost of Platonism. That's a great fight, not the fight against cancer, the fight against dogmatism. Clearly, the fight against cancer is a lot more popular than the fight against Platonism. But we don't have anything very impressive to show for it once we beat cancer. What is life for? That is what he means by setting the goal. And the only way there is through tension, as with the bow. Tension leads to strength, leads to power. And then the absence of tension is simply, again, life reduced to flatline.
Degeneration. So that's, I think, we've set ourselves up to approach Beyond Good and Evil, this powerful text, understanding that it is asking a series of questions aimed at revealing this question: what is life for? And how is it possible to live life, think about life in such a way which wouldn't undermine your ability to live? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, what kind of questions develop and create both a worthy goal, an ambition, a desire, a drive, something that would justify man, as he says in a different book, something that's worth seeing, worth being. And at the same time, what what kind of actions, habits, thoughts will actually allow you to do that? So the path and the way, which, as we'll see later, are really the same thing. Okay.
All right, so we have gotten through the introduction to the philosophy of the future, or at least to a philosophy of the future, as the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil has it. Hadar, this was very good, and I'm looking forward to getting to book one, The Prejudices of the Philosophers, in our next episode.
I'm looking forward.